Okay, so this is a lightning talk on how to test your EmberJS application. I'm going to start off and kind of go over just sort of generally what is a test, why should you write them, and then we'll go through some demo code and kind of get our hands dirty with writing some Ember tests. Also, don't worry about taking notes. My slides are up on SlideShare, and you can also, I haven't posted them yet, they're on my website at ember.party. Okay, so like, why do we test? There's lots of reasons. We want to write better code. There's less need for manual QA. There's living documentation. But the big things for me, especially in Ember, are confidence when you're refactoring code and confidence when you're upgrading your code. The Ember ecosystem, as anyone who's worked or tried to understand Ember knows, it moves really, really quickly. So having really robust tests helps a ton when you're trying to upgrade your application from, even in between, 1.12, 1.13, and especially onto 2.0, it's really helpful to have good tests, and Ember makes it easy. So at a high level, there are 3 levels of testing. In the traditional world, you'd probably see something like this, where you have the most unit tests. It's kind of the base of your testing pyramid. Then you have some integration tests and acceptance tests. In my opinion, Ember looks a little bit more like this. Kind of fewer unit tests, the majority of integration tests, and then a kind of smaller suite of acceptance tests. So let's talk through what all of those mean. So first, unit tests. In Ember, there are several things that you might want to unit test. Actions are really great. Computed properties with any sort of sophisticated logic, not just like a computed Boolean or something like that. Something that is doing a lot, and we want to make sure that the computed property is correct. Any mixins we're using all over the place. Ember makes mixins really, really easy, reusable, but you want to make sure it works correctly, and any utility functions you might generate. So at a high level, it's basically an input to a function produces the expected output. We're not really testing how that works with other things in our ecosystem. It's just I pass this parameter into a function, I expect to get something out of it. Integration tests. So Ember integration tests are components and the actions that they send out. This is sort of a new thing in 1.12 and ember-cli-mocha and ember-cli-qunit. It's easy to test your component and actions sent from it. So basically it looks something like this. You simulate an interaction in your test suite to your component, and then you make sure it has some state. A button changes, it fires an action that you expect to happen, that kind of thing. And then we have acceptance tests. So our rendered routes, our transitions between the routes, and then our communication with our external API server. So it looks something like this. You have an interaction to your application, and then it goes and does something. You do another interaction with your application, and it has some expected state. So imagine something your user's going to do. They're going to log into the site. They're going to change settings in their account profile. They're going to interact with your site in some way. This is sort of the top level. We're putting it all together. This is what a user's doing. So before I go into this, I want to touch on this really briefly. The Ember CLI default testing suite is testing in qunit. There's also another testing suite called Mocha, which uses a little bit different of a syntax, and it's specifically Mocha with Chai, the assertion language. This demo is going to be in Mocha because I prefer it to qunit. So the differences are basically qunit. If you're new to testing and you aren't a crotchety old man and you're not like, this is the way I like it, and like me, and that's why I use Mocha, use qunit. It's got first-class support. The syntax isn't fluent. It's a little more terse. So here you've got something like, test, it renders, function assert dot equal, this. It reads very machiney, versus Mocha, which has good support, and I work on this project on the side a little bit, but it has highly fluent syntax. So it has a button with text. Expect this to equal this. It just reads really, really nicely, which is why I prefer it. But know that there are some things that will, qunit's always going to have first-class support first, and Mocha might fall a little bit behind.
It feels the difference, like the difference between being really into Ruby and being really into JavaScript. To me, so if you like JavaScript as is, qunit kind of speaks to that.
Right.
And if you like the more Ruby more narrative.
It's definitely more like R-spec-y, behavioral driven. It has sort of like nested describe blocks. It has a lot of really nice things that I like, and this is what I use, but just note that it might be different than what you see in some guides. So let's do a quick demo. So I built this little app, and of course I don't have it running. So it's a really exciting application. You click the button to log in as me, and you sign in, and wow, I'm signed in. It shows a little message. Please don't write an app like this. But we're going to test this application a little bit. So this application has a couple of different things. It makes sure that I can't go to the dashboard without signing in. So I just refresh the page, and it kicks me back to sign in because I'm not logged in. So there's some logic there. I hit sign in. This is actually talking to a fake server with ember-cli-mocha, so it's actually returning a 200 yes, you're logged in. And so that's what we're gonna talk through testing on. Don't panic about if you miss a piece of this. The source is all on GitHub, and I'll share that link in my slides. So what do we test? Well, let's start at the base of the pyramid or the diamond in the Ember case with our unit tests. So I mentioned that I can't refresh on the dashboard page because I'm not logged in. So I made a mixin because there might be several pages I can go to and I'm not logged in, and I want to kick them back to say sign in. Like you can't view your account profile settings because you're not logged in. So sign in and then you can view it. By the way, don't write this kind of mixin. There's plenty of add-ons that do this for you, but for the sake of testing, let's take a look at this. So I inject a session in here, which just imagine that traces some state. Which route I want to go to if you're not signed in. And so we ask the session, hey, is this user logged in? If so, don't do anything. Otherwise, let's replace whatever route you're in with the sign-in route and make them sign in. So here is my test. So I want to simulate. I want to stub as much as possible to make sure that I'm testing for the specific state. So I had sign-in described here, but I want to actually pass that in to make sure if somebody changes that, all my tests don't start failing. A lot of this is boilerplate, so when I did ember-g or ember-generate mixins authenticated route, it created this for me. So a lot of this stuff is boilerplate. I'm going to mix this into a route that I create. I'm going to stub replace with. So because it's an Ember route, it has replace with, but because I'm not starting up the entire application, I'm just testing one function in a unit test, I want to make sure that I stub it out. And I'm using a library called sign-on to do this. You can Ember install ember-cli sign-on. It's really easy, it's right there. It'll basically take the old stub, or the old method here, and just replace it with something that I can test whether or not it was called. So then I want to test, it doesn't do anything if the sessions user exists, and it transitions to the sign-in route if it doesn't. So I changed this. It does nothing if they're logged in, and it transfers to the sign-in route if not logged in. It's updated in the source code. So on my session object, I'm going to set it as logged in true. I'm going to run before model, and I expect that I'm not replacing it with the sign-in route because we don't want this to do anything. They're signed in. We want to allow them to go right to this page that we're trying to look at. But if they're not logged in, so I'm setting this to false here, I call the before model and the function that we're testing, and I want to expect that my replace with function was called with my sign-in route. So I expect that it was called once and that actually happened. So when I run that, it's going to say subject.before model is going to run. It's going to say, nope, I'm not logged in. My replace with stub is called with my sign-in route. All is happy. Our mixin works as we expect. So we're just testing one function. We set up some state, input, output, make sure that it works correctly. So what do we integration test here? We have this little sign-in greeting here. When we first log in, it says, click the button below to log in as me, and then a sign-in button. So I actually built this piece as a component here. And this is the source code for the component. So I have my sign-in greeting, click the button to log in, and then a button which fires an action that just says sign in. So this is the corresponding JavaScript. Really simple. When you click the button, it fires a sign-in action. it fires that up with the user, so we can do something about signing that user. So here's my test. This is using the new Ember integration test for components. So you'll notice this kind of like interesting HBS and then the ES6 backtick. This is precompiled handlebars. So what that's doing is it's actually setting up a little micro container, and it's actually rendering my sign-in form component in this little testing suite, so I can test some state with it. So one of the really big advantages over a unit test is just that component. With an integration test, it will pull in whatever you need. So if you're relying on other models and components, it automatically gets populated. So it's super handy, it makes it really simple. So basically I'm creating a fake user object here with this email address, fluidbar.com. I'm rendering the sign-in form with that user, and then I want to make sure that the greeting contains my name. So this is another thing that's really nice about the chai assertion language. I would have had to do a lot with like manipulating the jQuery response. I can just say to contain. So even though that string contains, hey, click here to log in as this, all I care about is that it actually shows fluidbar.com. So chai assertion language makes that really easy, and it's another advantage sort of over queuing it in my mind. And then we also assert that there's a button. And you'll notice here that I'm not even setting up a user. I just want to make sure that in general I have a button called the sign-in call to action. And I'm using IDs here. This is something that I've learned sort of over time. It's handy to have an ID, especially if you're working with another designer. So we have a designer on my team, and he might want to change this class name to something else. And if I'm actually looking for the element class name button, and he changes it to BTN because he decided instead of Foundation he wants to use Bootstrap, all of a sudden all my tests start failing. So it's super handy to have an ID here that he can mess with the markup, and as long as it's still the same thing, like it's a sign-in call to action, I don't care what it manifests itself as, it's going to exist and my test is still going to work. So this was testing the content, and then remember when I click the button it fires an action. So I'm going to create a user, and then this syntax, this.on, is saying when the sign-in action is fired, it's going to get an action user, and I'm going to expect it to equal my user up here. So remember when I click sign in, it got the user and it passed it up in the action. So I want to make sure that's passed along. And then I'm calling done. This is kind of a trick. So in other tests, I'm not taking done as the function parameter, which means that once the test synchronously executes, it's going to say the test is done, and if there were no failures, the test passes. In this case, I want to make sure that my action is called. So I'm calling done here. So if I render the sign-in form with my user, and I click the button and nothing happens, it's going to sit there and wait, and it's going to say, I'm not told that the test is done yet, and it'll actually time out and fail if the action isn't fired. But if the action is fired, the action user equals the user that I'm passing in, it's going to call done, and our test will pass. So we're making sure that when I click that, it's firing an action, and it's sending up the user. And then an acceptance test for this. So one thing you didn't see is that if the server is down for some reason or responds with not a hey, you're logged in response, you're going to get that original blue alert message that says, sorry, we couldn't log you in. And I'm simulating this with Mirage here. Right there, so there's a failure, that one, it worked. So I want to test and make sure I'm handling the error case, because maybe the server goes down, I want to make sure that this application works appropriately. So I'm going to describe both states. I'm going to say, in success, creating a user, which this stuff is all hard-coded for this example, but I'm creating hello@benlover.com with password guest because it's really secure, and I transition to the dashboard on successful login, and I show a flash message as well. It says you're now logged in on success. So you'll notice a little bit different syntax here in the acceptance. Ember test helpers provide things like visit and click. As I mentioned, an acceptance test is what your user is going to do. They're going to be interacting with the website. They're visiting a page and they're clicking something or they're filling in an input. This is sort of the place to test that. So I visit the sign-in page, I click the sign-in button, and notice I'm still using my ID here. And then I expect the current path, which is another Ember helper, so this will tell me my current route, to be dashboard. So this and then is kind of cool. This exists in Mocha and in QUnit. But what this tells Ember to do is wait for all asynchronous behavior to be done before you execute this. So visiting the page and clicking and interacting with the DOM are both asynchronous behaviors. So I want to visit sign in, and that could talk to the server and populate a model or something like that. And clicking the button could have other side effects. So I want to make sure that I wait for all that asynchronous stuff to happen. So if I did visit, click, and then had expect right here, I'm not guaranteed that the visit and the transition has completed or the button click has completed. So I want to make sure that I wait. And you can stack these up, and then I'm saying, all right, once you're done with all the promises are resolved, expect that I'm on the dashboard page. And we show a flash message. So we do the same thing, we visit, we click the button, and then we expect to see a success alert which said you're now logged in. And then in failure, so I'm doing a little bit of hand waving here. If you want to see exactly how I'm doing this, take a look at the source code. But basically, I have it hard-coded to only respond to hello@benlimmer.com with password guessed. So if I'm passing something else, not Ben at Gmail, with the same password, I expect it to fail. And in this case, it won't transition to the dashboard, and it's going to show me that blue error box that says, sorry, you couldn't log in. So I'm going to do the exact same thing, actually. I'm going to visit the sign-in page, I'm going to click the button, but then instead of dashboard, I'm going to expect to be on the sign-in page. I want to make sure that it didn't transition me to the dashboard, didn't log me in. And then also I want to make sure that I have a danger alert box, which in that case we did. So if we take a look at the running test suite, we can tell, you can see that kind of flashing there in the box down in the bottom right. That's actually rendering our acceptance test. It's simulating a user running through and clicking things, and the server responding with the correct response. And that's got our application tested. It's also got our integration test here, and you'll notice that just the sign-in component is running. So yeah, basically that's a quick way to get into testing with Ember. Again, I'll post this stuff up. The demo project is up there. You can take a look at that. And I'm happy to take any questions. It's a big subject to talk about in a lightning talk, so hopefully I didn't go too fast. What's up?
I've seen some people, when you get a legit bug report, that gets added to the test suite. How do you guys handle that at bottom?
Sure. If it's possible for me to write a failing test that describes the bug report, I absolutely will write that, because clearly there was a gap in my test suite that, I somehow missed that. So we will definitely write a failing test if possible. There was a situation recently where I ran into something weird with Ember data that was doing something that I didn't expect, and we got close to release without realizing it. So I wrote a test that failed, running through the exact steps. It was actually an acceptance test, because it was like, well, if the user visits this page and then goes and does some stuff, and then goes here and goes and does some stuff, and then comes back to that same page, something's messed up. So what I did was I simulated each one of those steps. Well, first I verified it myself. I was like, oh, that's weird. Oh, yep, you're right, it is broken. Wrote a test for it, fixed the test, and then deployed it.
Awesome. Are we going to auto standby?
That might be the projector, I'm not too sure, but we can figure out if it shuts off.
Any other questions about, yeah, Ron?
How many tests do we have at Ibotta?
How many tests do we have at Ibotta? That's a great question, Ron. I work with Ron. Ron and I work the website. I think right now on our main product, we've got somewhere in the ballpark of 3,000 to 5,000 tests. And then in some of our smaller applications, I think we've got somewhere around 1,000 for each of them. Yeah.
How long does it take your tests to complete, all your tests?
That's a great question. How long does it take your tests to complete? So running in parallel, split into 3 jobs, our main app takes about 12 minutes to run, which is really long. And one of the big things that has changed with the component integration tests that are super nice is that it doesn't start up your entire app. So imagine every single test in an acceptance test has to boot your entire app, which in the case of our production web app takes almost a second. So each test we have as an acceptance test has to fill the container, has to load everything up. It takes forever. So the majority of our, we've got acceptance test suites that we wrote way back in the days of like Ember 1.7 when it was the only option, that take 4 minutes to run on their own. So over time, as we can move those things into component integration tests that test each piece individually, and then just move our acceptance tests to let's just run through, assuming that everything at the unit and integration level is tested. We're seeing our test suite, even though we're adding new functionality, we're seeing our test suite go down in time because we're moving away from acceptance tests. Because before, as opposed to the diamond, acceptance was, acceptance, so imagine you can see a diamond, and acceptance is on the top. It was all acceptance tests, which took a really long time and just ballooned our test suite quite a bit. But our new app that we started on Ember 1.12, we have, I think, 500 tests, and they run in the matter of like a minute and a half. So definitely not increasing as quickly as the other ones.
Does that affect the way that you develop at all? It seems like that would make like TDD in particular a little bit tricky. And Torin at EmberConf was talking about like test performance as like reducing redundancy in your test suite so that you can have it run quickly, so that you use them for every code change rather than waiting for the whole thing.
Right.
You have to like get some check and stuff.
Right, definitely. I think it does affect how we write code in some ways, but overall, I think I'm only writing unit tests for things that are like really, really critical business logic. Like we deposit cash into people's PayPal, right?
Sure.
So you earn money you unlock a rebate, you go and buy that product, you earn cash, and it sits in your Ibotta account, and then you cash it out. That thing is tested top to bottom.
Sure.
I unit test it, I integration test it, I acceptance test it. I really want to make sure that that piece works. Other places that are like, it's important business logic, but I have tests for it, and an integration test or an acceptance test, I might not write a unit test for it.
Sure.
And in fact, if you're following this model with unit tests sort of on the bottom of that triangle, hopefully you're not writing a ton of those.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Is there anything like guard to only run the test that would change?
Oh, to only run tests that change. That's one of the tough parts, is that it's hard to sort of figure out what has changed. So there's not a great product, and I agree, like something like guard in Rails is really handy because I change this controller and it runs the controller spec, and but currently there's nothing like that in Ember. One trick for that is if I pull up my test suite here, so you can do this in QUnit or in Mocha, but I can actually say, I'm only interested in running my sign-in test right now. So you can either click it here and this will just run those 4 tests, or you can start up your server with ember test, run the server, and -f for filter, and I can say sign in. So if I'm working on, like recently we released a new shopping list at Ibotta, and so even though our production web app has 3,000 to 5,000 tests, I just filter to shopping list, and if something else changes, our continuous integration with Travis catches it after a push. But I can be, if I'm working on sign-in, that took, 1.02 seconds. So it's pretty quick just to run the things that you're working on and then catch everything else before you merge.
What do you think is missing with the testing story?
I think the testing story is pretty good, but there's definitely a lot of places we can improve. The acceptance test helpers are super handy. The ones that are like visit and fill in and click, those are really handy. Those are not exposed in component integration tests yet. So you actually have to grab the jQuery element and trigger the click event on it, which is exactly what these test helpers are doing. So I think that's one of the biggest places we can improve is exposing this in a unit test. So I can just say click this, fill in this, and fill in, you would be so amazed by how much happens when you are typing stuff. Like it fires a change and an input and a key up and like all this crap that Ember Test Helpers hides behind something that I can just be like fill in and it works. That would be really, really handy to have an integration test, but they're new. Overall, I'm pretty satisfied with it, but there's definitely some weird like asynchronous things that happen, and the not exposing those test helpers I think is the number one thing that needs to be fixed.
Yeah, it seems like in components, they have such a different API surface than like controllers did. especially since we're merging those concerns.
Right.
To like, oh, where'd all my stuff go?
Right. Definitely. Any other questions before we move on to the next one? Great. Again, these will be up on ember.party, and if you search blimmer on SlideShare or on GitHub, you'll find all the slides. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.